In the year 1887, 70 men marched into Taggart's Mill, a human meat grinder situated dozens of miles away from the nearest breath of civilization. A few months later, their tyrannical foreman evaporated from the face of the earth. Not a single drop of blood, not a single trace of a struggle. There were only solitary footprints etched into the snow, leading deep into the abyssal forest, only to terminate abruptly before a colossal wooden structure, sealed tight without a single point of entry. Carved into its frigid wooden surface were countless 12-rayed circles weeping pitch-black sap. People are fond of borrowing ghost stories and supernatural entities to explain away this tragedy. It is a comforting lullaby to believe that evil descends from another realm. But the truth concealed within yellowed, decaying case files is infinitely more diseased. The monster did not lie in wait beneath the roots of the trees. It was forged from the -20-degree frost, from the bone-grinding exploitation, and from isolated minds pushed until they utterly shattered. Before I lead you into the crime scene of this blood-soaked case, I want to know, where are you listening to this story right now? Are you out in the woods? Inside a darkened car? Or are you sitting alone in a locked room in the dead of night? Leave a comment below, because I genuinely want to know where my listeners are situated as they allow the darkness of this narrative to seep into their minds. It matters far more than you might think, because if you remain alone in a confined space for too long, when the comforting sounds of the human world are extinguished, the brain will birth its own monsters just to keep itself entertained. And sometimes, those monsters are not mere hallucinations. They will borrow your very own hands to lift the axe. The air at Taggart's Mill always harbored an unmistakable signature taste, the scent of fermenting despair. Nestled 12 miles northeast of the town of Casca was a crude conglomeration of makeshift shacks erected violently amidst an ocean of white pines, pines so unimaginably dense that high noon filtered through like the dim, dying embers of dusk. 70 men, predominantly immigrants from Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, alongside a handful of vagabonds fleeing their own pasts, were crammed into a row of rough-hewn, splintering bunkhouses. Every night they slept upon mold-infested straw mattresses, inhaling a shared, suffocating atmosphere thick with the stench of sour sweat, perpetually damp leather boots, and the rancid, pungent odor of cheap salted pork. This place was no community. It was a prison without iron bars, ruled by Cyrus Taggart, a capitalist possessing the ruthless mentality of a brutal slave driver. Discipline here was absolute. Efficiency equated to your very life. Every single morning, when the deafening, abrasive clang of the iron bell tore through the freezing fog, 70 soulless corpses would drag their cracked, bleeding feet, bracing themselves beneath the weight of saws and axes as they waded into the deep woods. Death lurked behind every trunk. A 100-foot pine felled in the wrong direction would pulverize a logger's rib cage, reducing him to a pulpy mass of flesh that dyed the white snow a vibrant crimson. A snapped branch caught high up in the canopy, a lethal hazard the men bitterly dubbed a widowmaker, could free fall like a colossal guillotine, obliterating the skull of whoever was unfortunate enough to stand below. Drowning beneath the frozen river, freezing to death after losing the trail, succumbing to gangrene from a neglected, trivial cut. Death was simply a mundane entry on the timesheet. But Virgil Moss never died, nor did he ever truly live. Throughout his 15-year tenure as a tree faller, Virgil was regarded as a living legend, a lumberjack who had never committed so much as a single fractional error. At 34 years of age, he towered like a stone monolith hewn from the cliffs, his brawny, knotted muscles rippling beneath his frayed coat. Virgil's hands were monstrously oversized, encased in calluses as hard as bullhorns, and crisscrossed with thousands of perpetually weeping scars, the violent testaments of a lifetime wedded to nothing but an axe handle. His eyes bore the sickly blue-gray hue of a dead river in the dead of autumn, eyes that were an absolute, unadulterated void. Rumors whispered among the men claimed that Virgil spoke little because he was stoic, a man of profound action, an ancient soul harboring the raw strength of the mountains. But that was merely the romanticized gaze of outsiders. From the clinical perspective of criminal psychology, the terrifying silence and mechanical precision of Virgil Moss were not talents, they were symptoms. He suffered from severe schizoid personality disorder, heavily compounded by profound emotional blunting, after decades of having his physical and mental faculties drained dry in the darkest, most isolated corners of the continent. Virgil did not fell trees out of passion or a sense of duty. He chopped wood because it was the sole unconditioned reflex his brain had managed to retain to prove that he still existed. His mind was a padlocked room, devoid of light, devoid of sound. Isolation could never harm Virgil Moss, for he himself was the very embodiment of perfect isolation. It was precisely because of this flawless, soulless nature that Taggart entrusted Virgil exclusively with the logging operations in the Deep Cut, a tract of forest located 2 miles west of the main camp. This was the sacred burial ground of behemoth, ancient pines, their trunks so impossibly wide that 2 men linking arms could not encircle them. The atmosphere within the Deep Cut carried palpable physical pressure. The densely interwoven needles formed a tar-black vault, devouring the sunlight and plunging the entire forest into a necrotic silence. It was not a serene, peaceful quietude. It was a rigid, suffocating stillness, as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter. Accompanying Virgil every day was Otto Lindgren, a 23-year-old youth hailing from Sweden. Built as strong as a mule and vibrating with the restless energy of youth, Otto was a complete paradox to Virgil. He despised the silence. He vehemently loathed the desolate void of the Deep Cut. And so Otto talked. He talked incessantly, rambling endlessly about his family back in the old country, about a girl working at the town tavern, about his sun-drenched dreams of purchasing a farm. Otto wielded his words like a fragile torch, desperately attempting to illuminate the suffocating darkness of the timberland, trying to banish the spine-crawling dread that clung to his back. Virgil would respond only with low, guttural grunts from the back of his throat, leaving Otto to his monologues. Together they formed a precarious equilibrium, one man desperately clinging to his humanity, and another who had been entirely stripped of it. On the afternoon of January 24, 1887, that fragile equilibrium was officially severed. The sun had already begun to dip. The temperature plummeted to a degree where spittle would freeze solid before it even struck the earth. Virgil had found his rhythm, his muscles contorted and uncoiled. The steel axe blade violently tore through the air, sinking deep into the flesh of the ancient pine. The dry, rhythmic thwacks echoed with mechanical precision. Thwack, crack, thwack, crack. Splinters of wood burst forth like fresh arterial spray. Every swing of the axe was a pathologically meticulous calculation of angle and resistance. After more than an hour of relentless, uninterrupted chopping, sweat vaporized into white steam around Virgil's shoulders, and then an ear-splitting, agonizing crack ripped through the dead silence of the Deep Cut. The colossal trunk shuddered, leaning with a slow, menacing inevitability, before accelerating and crashing down upon the snowpack. A thunderous roar reverberated for miles through the woodland, sending a blinding cloud of snow dust billowing into the air. The tree was dead. It lay perfectly and precisely where Virgil had intended. Otto stepped forward, wielding his smaller felling axe to begin stripping the rough branches along the main trunk. But after only a few strokes, the young man's chopping abruptly ceased. The space was instantly drained of all sound. When Virgil looked up, he saw Otto taking a step backward, his eyes blown wide, fixated in pure horror upon the rough bark at chest height of the newly felled tree. Virgil. Otto's voice was a dry, trembling rasp. It did not carry the pitch of sheer terror, but rather a thick, paralyzing bewilderment, as if his brain had just collided with an image that defied all conventional logic. "Come look at this." Virgil buried his axe head into the stump, his heavy, deliberate footsteps crushing the powdery snow as he rounded the massive wooden carcass. There, carved deeply into the thick, coarse bark of the 200-year-old pine, was a symbol. It was not the standard cross slashes or property markings commonly utilized by logging crews. It was a perfect circle, roughly 8 inches in diameter. Radiating from the absolute center were 12 straight lines, spaced with flawless, terrifying symmetry like the spokes of a temporal wheel. At the terminus of each line sat a smaller, meticulously carved circle. The strokes that formed it were unfathomably deep, brutally lashing through the outer bark and plunging into the sapwood beneath. But what made Otto shudder was not the geometry of the shape. It was its age. The edges of the lacerations had blackened with the passage of time, dyed the pitch-dark hue of tree sap that had congealed over dozens of bitter winters. Virgil slowly crouched down. He peeled off one of his frayed leather gloves, exposing a rough, scar-mottled hand, and deliberately traced his calloused fingertips over the surface of the grooved lines. The wood surrounding the symbol was ice-cold. Not the superficial chill of surface frost, but a profound, frigid miasma that had seeped deep into the grain, as if someone had pressed block of glacial ice against this very spot for an eternity, allowing the absolute zero to die and take root there. "What do you think it is?" Otto swallowed hard, his breath pluming in streams of gray vapor. "Indians, maybe? The Odawa or the Ojibwe around here?" Virgil shook his head, his gaze, as still as a frozen lake, never wavering from the 12-rayed circle. No, the indigenous tribes did not employ such sterile, cold, geometric signs. Their lexicon was comprised of beasts, the flow of water birds, and the lore of spirits. This was mathematical. It was industrial. Furthermore, the carving sat at chest height on the trunk, meaning it had been etched when the tree was already fully grown, not when it was a mere sapling meant to stretch upward over time. But this tree was a century and a half old, yet the carving, while appearing aged, could not possibly belong to a bygone century, 20, perhaps 30 years at most. Feeble minds would instantly conjure thoughts of dark sorcery, of hexes cast by black-hearted witches, or the curses of some savage tribe eagerly terrifying themselves. But the mind of Virgil Moss, already frozen in profound apathy, operated on a far more ruthless and pragmatic mechanism. This mark was not the handiwork of ghosts or deities. Gods do not need to expend the grueling labor to wield a carving knife, measuring down to the millimeter to trace 12 perfect lines. Demons do not sweat to slash apart tree bark. This was the labor of a human being, a creature of flesh and bone. But why would an ordinary human venture this deep into this lethal domain, standing amidst the suffocating gloom devoid of sunlight, simply to patiently carve a 12-hour clock onto a tree? 12 lines. Did they represent 12 hours of soul-crushing labor under the crack of a whip and a barrage of curses? Or did they symbolize 12 months of confinement in an endless winter with no hope of escape? The stale scent of pine resin invaded Virgil's sinuses, mingling with the metallic tang of his saw blade and the necrotic reek of rotting leaves. He was not staring at a spiritual ward. He was staring at a plea for salvation, or rather, a graffiti of terminal despair. The first physical evidence that, within this very forest, there had once existed human brains incapable of withstanding the crushing atmospheric pressure of isolation, and they had slowly, methodically, utilized their own madness to scar the world. Forget it. Virgil dismissed it coldly, slipping his torn leather glove back on. His voice was utterly flat, stripped of a single ounce of emotion. Get back to work. Taggart needs this timber before the thaw. They resumed their labor. The saw shrieked once more. The pine trunks continued to bleed. But when the final, anemic rays of sunlight were swallowed by the horizon, darkness collapsed upon the deep cut, bringing with it a sickly, necrotic blue-gray hue that felt entirely surreal. The 40-minute trek back to the camp that night stretched on longer than ever before. Every single stump they passed resembled a shadowy figure standing dead still. Otto did not utter another word. The silence had finally devoured the young man. As for Virgil, deep within his eerily quiet mind, he knew one absolute truth. The unnatural cold radiating from the carving was not the work of the weather. It was the chill of a fellow human creature who had lost every shred of its humanity. And that thing, it seemed, was still lurking somewhere close, very close, right behind them. The sensation of a frigid breath exhaling down their spines, clinging like a parasite to the napes of their necks, did not dissipate even as the two men slipped past the heavy oak door and into the bunkhouse. The temperature inside bunkhouse number 4 was roughly 20 degrees warmer than the unforgiving outdoors, courtesy of 2 cast-iron stoves blazing at either end, but the stagnant air trapped within carried a toxicity that ravaged the human soul in an entirely different manner. 70 men were stuffed into a claustrophobic space, every crack and crevice sealed shut to fend off the sub-zero elements, their collective stench amalgamated into a tangible entity. It was the reek of sour sweat driven deep into unwashed wool, the acrid bite of sulfur, the foul breath of cheap tobacco, and the rot of meat decaying between unbrushed teeth. The space was a cacophony of wretched sounds, hacking coughs erupting from lungs shredded by sawdust, moans escaping from night terrors, the frantic grinding of teeth, and the restless shifting of bodies upon moldy bedbug-infested straw mattresses. In the realm of medicine, there is a clinical term for the invisible atmospheric pressure slowly pulverizing the sanity of these men: cabin fever. It is not a viral infection. It is a syndrome of psychological fragmentation that occurs when human beings are imprisoned in tight quarters, entirely severed from the outside world for prolonged periods. Initially, it manifests as mere irritability. This deteriorates into chronic insomnia, and finally it reaches the stage where the brain begins to cannibalize itself, spawning vivid hallucinations and supreme paranoia, twisting bedmates into faceless enemies. That night, lying on a rickety bunk 3 paces from the door, Virgil Moss did not sleep. He lay flat on his back, his slate-gray eyes wide open, staring into the pitch-black ceiling. The symphony of snores from 69 surrounding men seemed to recede to an immeasurable distance, giving way to an overwhelming, suffocating silence from within. Virgil's mind drifted back to the deep cut. The radiating lines carved into the flesh of the tree danced relentlessly in the darkness against his retinas. And then, straddling the blurred boundary between wakefulness and sleep, Virgil plunged into a fever dream. He saw himself standing amidst a limitless ocean of pines. Thousands, tens of thousands of colossal trunks encircled him, and upon every single trunk was slashed a deep, bleeding wound weeping pitch-black sap. The 12-rayed circle, everywhere. Within that dream state, Virgil suddenly comprehended the absolute meaning of the symbol. A grand and abyssal epiphany flooded his chest cavity. But the very microsecond the abrasive clang of the wake-up bell tore the night asunder at 4 a.m, that profound meaning evaporated into nothingness, leaving behind a gaping, frigid void in the pit of his stomach, alongside a debilitating exhaustion in his muscle fibers, as if, throughout the entire night, his physical body had never rested on that bed, but had been marching for miles through the frozen snow. Despite Otto's feeble pleas to request a transfer to a different logging sector, the following morning, Virgil stubbornly retrieved his axe and marched straight back into the deep cut. The dawn's cold was razor-sharp, slicing mercilessly into any exposed patch of skin. As the 2 men penetrated deeper into the core of the deep cut, the silence of the previous day did not merely return. It mutated into a crushing, palpable physical pressure bearing down on their shoulders. Any psychiatric expert would instantly recognize the lethal danger of this environment: sensory deprivation. The feet of compacted snow beneath their boots acted as a colossal sponge, siphoning away every frequency of sound. The interwoven canopy of pine needles eclipsed the sky overhead, annihilating all concepts of time and light. There was no birdsong, no whistling wind, not even the microscopic scuttling of insects beneath the bark. The void here was absolute. When the human brain is starved of all auditory input from its environment for a sufficient duration, it panics. To fill that terrifying vacuum, the central nervous system is sought overdrive. Anuxas upstung through the skupchats to distorts ministry ground noise into meaningful sounds, or worse, to broadcast phantom audio directly from within the skull. Otto Lindgren was the first casualty of this psychological torture. Transforming from a vocal Swedish youth who endlessly filled the void with idle chatter, Otto abruptly went mute. He swung his axe with erratic, broken rhythm. His breathing became shallow and frantic, exhaling trembling plumes of white smoke into the frigid air. Intermittently, mid-swing, Otto would freeze, his eyes widening in stark terror as he whipped his head around, staring fixedly into the hollow, empty shadows between the pine trunks. Paranoia was corroding him from the inside out. "Do you hear that?" Otto whispered, his voice cracking from severe dryness. "Hear what?" Virgil asked coldly, his hands never ceasing their rhythmic sharpening of the saw blade. "Footsteps, snow crunching, someone is circling us." Otto's knuckles gripping the axe handle were bone-white, bulging with blue veins, and just a moment ago I saw a shadow, a very tall man, wearing a dark cloak. He was standing right behind that broken pine over there, not 50 yards away. He was watching us, Virgil. Virgil stopped. His frigid gray eyes slowly swept across the sector Otto had just pointed out. There was nothing, only the ashen, monolithic trunks standing as motionless as unmarked graves. Not a single soul. Not a single fresh footprint marred the pristine white snow, save for the deep trenches the 2 of them had just carved out. But let us pause here to dissect this through the lens of criminal psychology. The testimonies of these two men are in supreme conflict. Why is Otto, a healthy young man with a sound mind, repeatedly descending into a state of panic over visual and auditory hallucinations, while Virgil Moss, a man riddled with psychological fractures, maintains an unnatural, undisturbed calm? People generally fear anomalies. Virgil was not unafraid because he was brave. He was unafraid because in his subconscious, the anomaly felt familiar. The most spine-chilling hypothesis to formulate at this juncture is not whether there was a forest demon in a black cloak stalking them. The question is, was the shadow Otto saw truly out there? Or had derealization cleanly cleaved Virgil's psyche in two? One half playing the silent, dutiful lumberjack, while the other half was an abyssal alter ego that had detached from his physical form to prowl the deep woods. And Otto, pushed to the absolute brink of nervous tension, had accidentally tuned into that deranged frequency, projecting through this suffocating space. Every psychological hypothesis seemed destined for a dead end until early afternoon, when they discovered the carving. It was etched into an ancient pine that was still standing, approximately 50 yards north of where they had found the first symbol. Otto spotted it first. He stumbled backward a few steps, a choked, strangled sob escaping his throat as the saw slipped from his grasp and into the snow. Virgil stepped forward. At chest height, mutilating the coarse bark of the tree, was yet another 12-rayed circle. But this time the spine-crawling dread did not stem from the mystical obscurity of the shape. It arose from the direct, brutal forensic evidence staring them right in the face. In stark contrast to the blackened ancient patina of yesterday's symbol, this carving was an open, gaping wound. It was violently fresh. The cuts were razor-sharp, surgically slicing through the sap to expose the inner flesh of the timber, flesh that was pallid and sickly white, like the skin of a corpse yet to bloat. Virgil stripped off his glove and leaned in close. The atmosphere surrounding them felt perpetually frozen, but as his scar-tissued fingertips traced the deep grooves of the circle, a jolt of icy electricity shot up his spine. Tree sap. From deep within the timber's lacerations, droplets of amber pine resin were seeping out, cresting the edges of the cuts and sluggishly trailing down the bark. It was thick, viscous, tacky, and it was still warm. That minute warmth transferring to Virgil's fingertips was the blade that executed all fallacies of ghosts and ghouls. We are talking about a temperature of -20 degrees Celsius. Under such brutal climatic extremes, all matter freezes solid. Tree sap, the moment it makes contact with sub-zero air, will congeal and harden into something resembling glass in under 15 minutes. If the sap was still flowing, if it still retained enough slick warmth to cling to human flesh, it meant one absolute, indisputable scientific truth. This cut had just been made. It was created right before their very eyes, 10 minutes ago, perhaps even 5. The one wielding the blade, the one who mutilated this tree, the one constructing this altar of madness, was no specter or shadow from a century past. He was a man. He had a pulse, he drew breath, and he had just stood in this exact spot, his boots treading upon the very same patch of snow where Virgil's boots now rested. Who could have done this? Otto stammered, his bloodshot eyes sweeping frantically across the impenetrable wall of gray pines. No one works in this sector. No one has walked past us since morning. Virgil did not reply. He rubbed his thumb and index finger together, feeling the sticky amber resin, rapidly losing its warmth and hardening against the biting northern wind. Otto's words were the truth. Taggart's camp was run like a military installation. The deep cut was their exclusive, assigned domain. Not a single soul had breached this territory since dawn. The snow around the base of this tree, aside from the inexplicable scuffed disturbances near the roots, held absolutely no third set of footprints approaching from the outside. So if no one had walked up to this tree, who had carved the symbol? The north wind threaded through the canopy high above, emitting a blood-curdling howl, like the collective sigh of 1,000 mummified corpses. Virgil slowly turned his head, staring dead into Otto. The young man was shivering violently, his body curled inward, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the acute panic of cabin fever fully detonated within him. Virgil knew Otto could not be the author. He was far too cowardly, far too weak-willed to orchestrate this level of immaculate silence. And then, Virgil's gaze slowly drifted downward, coming to rest upon the handle of the brutal steel axe gripped tightly in his own right hand. Beads of cold sweat began to prickle at the veteran lumberjack's temples. His muscles locked into absolute rigidity. A distorted, warped fragment of memory from the previous night suddenly detonated like a crack of thunder within the hollow of his skull. The bone-deep exhaustion in his legs, the vision of himself stands midst 10,000 mutilated trees, and the flawless, pitch-black void that consumed his mind every time the axe was raised. If the monster did not come from the outside, if there was no third party at the scene, was it possible that the one carving these bleeding wounds into the wood, the one orchestrating this suffocating atmosphere of death, was the very creature breathing beneath the skin of Virgil Moss, hiding behind the dark chasms of dissociative amnesia? The forest never birthed the devil, it merely provided the devil with a space quiet enough and blind enough for the bloodthirsty beast to find a reason to step into the light, pick up the axe, and begin tallying the graves. The horrifying realization that an absolute evil might be parasitically thriving beneath his own flesh, lurking within the black holes of his dissociative amnesia, did not send Virgil Moss into a panic that made him drop his axe. On the contrary, it drove a nail of obsession deep into his frontal lobe. That night, Virgil did not sleep. He lay paralyzed on his straw bunk, reeking of ammonia and sour sweat, listening to the agonizing grinding of teeth from the lumberjacks whose minds were being eaten alive by cabin fever in the suffocating dark. The ravenous desire to flay open the truth clawed at Virgil's chest cavity. In the end, what mankind craves above all else is not safety, but answers. At 4 a.m, before the wake-up bell could even tear through the congealed fog, Virgil silently rose. He shoved a rock-hard biscuit and a small notebook into his heavy coat pocket, abandoned Otto, who was whimpering in the throes of a nightmare, and marched alone, axe in hand, into the opaque night of the deep cut. The pre-dawn sky bore the necrotic gray of rusted iron. The atmosphere was so profoundly still that Virgil could hear the hiss of his own blood surging through the capillaries behind his eardrums. The -20 cold was no longer a meteorological event. It was a living entity slithering down his collar, devouring every knuckle, and freezing the pulmonary fluids with every drawn breath. The compacted snow beneath his boots emitted a dry, desolate crunch. Not a single bird, not a single gust of wind. Sensory deprivation had once again thrown its shroud over the space, transmuting the forest into a colossal solitary confinement cell of a madhouse. When he returned to the precise location of the bleeding pine from the previous afternoon, Virgil did not halt. He pushed further north, sinking deeper into the blackest core of the Appalachian ridge, where behemoth trunks stood shoulder to shoulder like the wooden bars of a colossal cage. Sunlight was eternally barred from touching the earth here. Everything existed solely through the sickly, pale blue-gray lens of a cadaver. And then the madness unfurled its macabre layers. Within the span of less than an hour of blind navigation, Virgil discovered 11 more symbols. 11 12-rayed circles gouged deeply into the flesh of living pines. Exactly like the tree from yesterday, every single one of these wounds was violently fresh. The pallid inner wood wept thick, sticky streams of amber sap, carrying with it the raw, earthy stench of bleeding death. Virgil withdrew his notebook, snapping off the tip of the pencil with teeth that chattered violently, and meticulously charted the location of each mutilated tree. As he connected the plotted points across the rough paper, a razor-sharp truth sliced through his cognition. These symbols did not manifest at random. They were calculated with an infinitesimally low margin of error, forming a corridor, an invisible boundary line, designed to lure its prey straight toward the northwest, directly into the absolute heart of the darkness. Pressing forward along that bleeding corridor for another 3 miles, Virgil came to an abrupt halt. The air before him seemed to thin out. The monolithic canopy of pine needles overhead parted slightly, shedding a faint, sickly luminescence. Before his eyes lay an empty clearing. It was no natural clearing born of the earth's own design. Any seasoned eye trained in the ways of the timberland would immediately recognize the sickly, artificial nature of this space. The pines encircling the barren patch grew at terrifyingly precise intervals, as if they had been coerced into standing in a flawless ring by some mandate from the realm of the dead. And situated dead in the center of that desolate earth, towering, grotesque, and pitch black, stood a colossal wooden structure. Virgil tightened his grip on his axe handle, advancing with slow, deliberate paces. The stench of necrotic wood violently invaded his nostrils, thick with the musty rot of ancient moss and primordial mud. The structure was cylindrical, rearing up roughly 12 feet in height, equivalent to a 2-story building. It was forged from hundreds of crude pine logs, stacked and interlocked at the corners with such an airtight, suffocating precision that not even the thinnest knife blade could slip between the seams. The surface of the timber bore the dull, sickly hue of black tar, veiled by a layer of bone-white hoarfrost that spackled the wood like flakes of dead skin. Upon every single log comprising this monolith, without exception, the 12 rayed circles were densely carved, thousands of blind wooden eyes glaring down at Virgil. He circumnavigated the base of the tower, his heartbeat drumming a sluggish yet crushing cadence against his rib cage. There was no main door, there were no windows. There was not a single fissure permitting entry to the interior. It was a perfectly sealed mausoleum. Decades later, amateur folklorists might eagerly romanticize this tower as the handiwork of the devil, an altar erected by the hands of supernatural forces. But to a mind wired with the clinical logic of forensics and psychology like Virgil Moss, this structure was a death sentence. Strip away that tedious spiritual shroud and stare directly into the unforgiving laws of physics. The pine logs used to assemble this tower weighed hundreds of pounds apiece. Simply felling them, bucking them, and hauling them to an open clearing deep within this abyssal forest already constituted a mammoth volume of labor. But to hoist those gargantuan timbers to a height of 12 feet, to hew the joints with a sharpened axe, and to seamlessly fuse them using impeccable interlocking joinery without the aid of a single iron nail or strand of rope, demanded a masterclass in architectural carpentry. No phantom horde of invisible demons could accomplish such a feat. It could only have been birthed by the hands of men made of flesh and bone, a multitude of men. Or, perhaps, by a solitary entity possessing Herculean stamina, operating in the throes of a rabid, manic frenzy spanning countless consecutive nights. The true spine-crawling terror emanated not from specters, but from brutal reality. If this construct was birthed by mortals, what was its insidious purpose? The Swedish and Norwegian lumberjacks of Taggart's camp were already hollowed out, utterly depleted after 12 hours of penal labor every single day. How could they possibly harbor the residual strength to stumble blindly through the night, under sub-zero torture, just to erect such a meaningless sepulchre? The answer lay buried within the concept of the architecture of madness. When the suffocating weight of cabin fever shoves a human psyche past the precipice of sanity, the brain ceases to operate on the biological imperative of energy conservation. Within a manic episode or a dissociative fugue state, the human vessel can utterly bypass all sensations of agony, exhaustion, and starvation to serve a delusional absolute. Those condemned, wretched loggers, could have been slinking out here night after night. Their repressed, festering hatred for Cyrus Taggart, the suffocating resentment of being entombed in the dark, had molded them into a nameless, fanatical cult. This tower was no altar offered to the forest deities. It was a wooden guillotine. It was a monument to butchery and rebellion. Virgil stripped off his glove and pressed his naked palm flat against a log at chest height. A violently, excruciating, freezing sensation skewered straight through his epidermis, racing up his forearm to stab into his very marrow. The archaic records passed down through the years would whisper that the tower's chill was unnatural, that dark sorcery had cannibalized the thermal energy of anything that dared touch it. How utterly laughable! The scientific truth was infinitely more merciless. It was the symptom of hypothermia hallucination. When Virgil bared his hand amidst the -20-degree wasteland, his core body temperature had already plummeted into the red zone of mortal peril. Blood autonomously retreated from the extremities to shield the vital organs. His hand in that moment was nothing more than a slab of frozen meat. When the epidermal surface is stripped of its capacity to perceive heat, making contact with the dense hoarfrost, clinging to the wood, causes the nerve receptors to violently short-circuit. The sensation of being chilled to the bone was, in reality, the silent scream of necrosis beginning to devour his cellular tissue. Virgil's own deteriorating mind was contorting physical perception, transmuting the tower into a phantom monolith, when the grim reality was that his own body was actively dying. Virgil hastily recoiled his hand, violently scrubbing it against the coarse wool of his coat in a desperate bid to resurrect warmth. His breathing fractured, wheezing with a harsh, abrasive rasp like sandpaper, grinding against sandpaper. He backed away a few paces, sweeping his gaze away from the tower and casting it upon the pines bordering the barren earth. Yet another grisly piece of forensic evidence presented itself. Etched into the trunks of the trees forming the perimeter of the clearing were not the complex 12-rayed circles, but rather slashes, horizontal, decisive, brutal lacerations, driven deep into the bark by the cruel bite of an axe. The exposed flesh of the wood had long oxidized to a necrotic, asphyxiated black. Virgil began to count the rusty metallic tang of seeping blood blooming on his cracked, parched lips. 1, 2, 3, 15, 30, 47 slashes. Scattered across 47 individual trunks. These gashes were absolutely not the preparatory marks for felling timber, delivered at chest height, driven by a lateral swing, possessing only a single, solitary strike per tree. Within the semiotics of serial murderers or extremist cults, this action carried a glaring statistical significance: tally marks, 47 axe wounds, correlating precisely with the 47 souls who had vanished without a trace across the lumber camps of northern Michigan over the span of 2 decades. The wooden monstrosity looming before Virgil was no random architectural whim. It was a psychological internment center, or, far more pragmatically, the massive lid to a colossal mass grave. That hollow core, devoid of windows or entryways, was the physical manifestation of the absolute emptiness festering within the souls of its creators. Those lumberjacks, stripped of their basic human rights, had constructed a prison for themselves, only to subsequently weaponize that very prison as an instrument to sacrifice the enemies they loathed above all else. Virgil stared intently at the sealed tower, a barbed, venomous realization slithering across his synapses. If the 47 tally marks had existed for an extended period, yet the fresh weeping lacerations charting the trail had only been carved mere hours ago. It meant that the meticulous preparations for the 48th mark were already complete. Amidst the viscous, congealed silence of the desolate woods, a microscopic rustling sound emanated from the dark periphery of the ancient pines. It was not the shifting of an avalanche. It was not the snapping of a dead, desiccated branch. It was the distinct friction of heavy wool rubbing against itself. Someone, or perhaps a collective of someones, was standing just at the edge of the clearing, entirely concealed within the eternal, impenetrable shadows of the Appalachian ridge, silently observing him. The trap was not being laid for some mythological beast. The trap was fully primed, and the hidden axes in the dark were merely waiting for the tolling bell of judgment to drop upon the prey. That subtle rustle slipped through the frozen atmosphere, pinning itself directly to the nape of Virgil Moss's neck like an ice pick. He did not turn his head. Amidst the brain-freezing cold of the Appalachian depths, the most primal survival instinct, hardwired into the lumberjack's skull, dictated a chilling truth. There are secrets that, once met with a gaze, demand the ultimate toll of permanently becoming a part of them. Virgil retreated, his boot tips cautiously erasing their depressions in the snow, and then silently turned his back, dissolving into the ashen, necrotic fog to return to the camp. That night brought a suffocating, asphyxiating stillness to Taggart's mill. It was not the tranquility of a deep lumber, but the thick, volatile silence of a buried fuse quietly burning down. And then, before the dawn's iron bell could even ring out, that fuse officially detonated. Cyrus Taggart had vanished. The news bled through the rows of moldering straw bunks not in frantic, panicked screams, but through dry, rasping murmurs that moaned like dulled saw blades. A man from the sled-hauling crew swore on his life that he had seen Foreman Taggart clutching his deer-hunting rifle and swathed in a heavy bearskin coat, trudging sullenly north, heading straight into the deep cut in the dim pre-dawn light. The man claimed Taggart was going hunting. Virgil stood beside the cast-iron stove, vigorously rubbing his cracked, coarse hands together, feeling a wave of nauseating bile rise to the roof of his mouth. His tongue tasted the bitter, acidic tang of gastric fluids laced with sulfur smoke, a clumsy, grotesquely crude lie, so blatant it bordered on the absurd. Cyrus Taggart, a skinflint capitalist, willing to dock a laborer's wages over a chipped axe blade, a foreman who worshipped the extortion of human labor as his singular religion, would willingly squander precious morning hours to drag a rifle into the woods for a hunt in -20-degree cold. No, Taggart never ventured into the timber alone without barking orders. He did not voluntarily step outside his perimeter of power. He had been lured or forcibly dragged away. By some macabre machination, the 12-raid trap had finally snapped shut. Beside Virgil, Otto Lindgren was as pallid as an unembalmed corpse. The young man's lips violently quivered as he babbled incoherent nonsense about forest demons and the ancient curses of the indigenous tribes. Otto wanted to report it. He wanted to tear the entire camp apart in a frantic search. But as Virgil's gaze swept across the gaunt, ashen faces of the Swedish and Norwegian loggers who sat in sullen silence, slurping their watery, grease-laden pork soup, he was struck by a paralyzing realization that froze the blood in his veins. Not a single one of them appeared surprised. 70 men, 70 pairs of sunken, hollow eyes, devoid of a single flicker of panic. They possessed a flawless, immaculate indifference, the apathy of actors who had already memorized the script. It was at that exact moment that the phenomenon of cabin fever ceased to be an isolated clinical diagnosis. It had mutated into a cross-contaminating virus, a virulent strain of mass hysteria. Taggart's Mill was no longer a logging camp. It was a cult actively concealing a blood-soaked secret. Feigning the necessity to finish their stalled timber quota, Virgil seized Otto by the collar, violently dragging the young man out of the claustrophobic stench of the bunkhouse, marching straight toward the deep cut. The pilgrimage back to that barren clearing had never felt so crushingly heavy. The temperature seemed to have plunged even further into the abyss since yesterday. Every inhaled breath felt like inhaling thousands of microscopic glass shards that shredded the lungs. The snow beneath their boots was no longer powdery. It had calcified into a thin crust of ice, splintering with a skeletal crunch beneath their rusted soles. They tracked the macabre trail marked by the bleeding, lacerated pines. And there, profoundly stamped into the necrotic gray snow of the dawn, were the unmistakable footprints of Taggart. The heel of the boot was worn down asymmetrically on one side, an imprint that belonged to no one else. The depressions were deep, the stride lengths violently erratic. Through the analytical lens of a crime scene investigator, this was not the gait of a confident hunter stalking his prey. These were the footprints of a man being dragged or staggering forward in a state of absolute, blind panic, likely suffering from a severe concussion resulting from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Surrounding Taggart's tracks were faint, sweeping disturbances, as though someone had dragged a massive pine bough across the snow to obliterate any secondary sets of footprints. It was a cold, calculated staging of a crime scene, reeking entirely of human malice. As the two men breached the boundary of the behemoth pines, the clearing revealed itself. The tar-black wooden tower still loomed there, suffocated by the silent glare of its myriad 12-rayed eyes. Taggart's footprints traced a desperate, dragging line straight from the tree line, terminating dead at the base of the sealed wooden wall, and vanished, a blank slate. There was no arterial spray. There were no signs of a physical struggle. The tracks simply ceased to exist at the curved surface of the foundational log, as if the foreman had been swallowed whole by this architectural abomination into another dimensional plane. Otto suffered a total psychological collapse. He crumpled to the snow, clutching his head as racking sobs tore from his throat, sounding agonizingly like the whimpers of a dog trapped in a wire cage. "He's gone. That thing took him." The tower opened up and swallowed him alive. Otto shrieked, the sound instantly muffled and crushed by the atmospheric pressure of the millions of pine needles above. "Shut your mouth," Virgil hissed through clenched teeth. He forced the freezing air deep into his lungs to prevent his heart rate from detonating. His mind analytically dissected the colossal structure. Timber cannot open of its own volition. Matter cannot simply cease to exist. If there was no entryway on the sides, then the breach had to be from above, or from below. Suddenly, from the abyssal depths of the tower's hollow core, a sound reverberated upward. It commenced as a rhythmic, wet, labored wheezing, echoing sluggishly through the grain of the wood. Then, a secondary noise sliced through. A muffled, choked groan, followed by an ear-piercing, blood-curdling scream that was grotesquely distorted, echoing from an unfathomable depth, the voice of Cyrus Taggart. He was screaming the name of God. He was begging for absolution in a shattered, fragmented pitch, drowning in thick, viscous fluids pooling in his throat. Virgil seized Otto by the shoulder, violently jerking the young man to his feet. "Interlock your hands, give me a boost now." Despite the sheer panic paralyzing every nerve in his body, Otto complied with mechanical obedience. He dropped to one knee in the snow, tightly weaving his 10 fingers together. Virgil planted one boot into those trembling, intertwined hands. Channeling the brute, explosive power of a man who had swung an axe for 15 years, he launched himself upward into the frigid air. His leather-clad fingers clawed frantically at the freezing surface of the uppermost wooden ring. He gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming in agonizing protest as he violently hauled his entire body mass over the lip of the tower. Virgil's chest pressed flush against the frozen timber. The acidic, biting cold seared through his wool coat, tearing at his flesh, and then Virgil Moss bowed his head and looked down. The tableau that violently assaulted his retinas was no phantasmagoric underworld, nor was it a gateway leading to the afterlife as the urban legends so desperately wove. The reality was 1,000 times more savage, agonizing, and brutally grounded. The interior of this 12-foot tower possessed no floor. Rather, the earth enclosed within the wooden ring had been excavated, frantically and feverishly gouged out, to form a cavernous, funnel-shaped abyss, plunging straight down into the sterile bedrock of the Appalachian ridge. A gargantuan pit trap, plunging at least 30 feet deep, as pitch-black as the belly of a leviathan. The putrid stench of rotting soil rose in sickening waves, intermingling with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the bitter, earthly aroma of natural arsenic seeping from the subterranean strata. This was the precise acoustic reason Taggart's voice had been so grotesquely warped. The phenomenon of acoustic resonance within a cylindrical shaft of earth and wood had transmuted the screams of a mortal man into the bellows of a monster. At the very bottom of the pit, illuminated by a sickly, anomalous sliver of light, filtering down from some imperceptible fissure, he saw Cyrus Taggart. The imperious, tyrannical foreman was now nothing more than a pulverized mound of mangled meat. Both of Taggart fractured at unnatural, horrific angles, jagged shards of bone puncturing through his linen trousers in a pool of spreading crimson. He was craning his neck upward, his face a smeared mask of mud and bloody saliva, the whites of his eyes rolled back in the ultimate extremity of terror. He screamed incessantly, his bare hands clawing in sheer futility against the vertical earthen walls, slipping on slick roots and icy grime. But Taggart was not alone at the bottom of the pit. Virgil held his breath, his pupils dilating wildly to adapt to the abyssal gloom. Just beyond the feeble halo of light where Taggart convulsed, lingering in the penumbra clinging to the pit's walls, there were shadows. Dozens of shadows standing in absolute stillness, encasing the foreman. Initially, Virgil's brain was deceived by acute claustrophobia and the viscous darkness, tricking him into believing these were the decomposed corpses, the resurrected husks of the 47 vanished loggers rising to exact their vengeance. But no, demons do not resurrect from the grave. Demons still draw breath. The shadows gradually materialized into human forms. They wore gray wool coats, they wore hobnailed leather boots, and gripped tightly in their hands were logging axes caked in heavy mud. There stood Lucien Broussard, the grizzled French carpenter. There were the sullen Norwegian youths who never uttered a single syllable during meals. These were the very colleagues who had shared his bunkhouse, eaten from the same stewpot, and breathed the exact same sulfuric air with Virgil just the night before. They were no phantoms. They were a mob that had violently breached the absolute threshold of human endurance. The pathology of cabin fever, weaponized by deep-seated class hatred, had transfigured 70 destitute lumberjacks into a pack of rabid beasts. They had covertly excavated this pit over countless grueling nights, erecting this tower as an altar of judgment, orchestrating the carved symbols to weave a supernatural veil that would flawlessly camouflage their perfect crime. The tower did not swallow Taggart. These men had bludgeoned him senseless, hurled him from the lip of the tower into the abyss, shattered his legs to cripple any hope of ascension, and simply stood there in the freezing dark, silently savoring the desperate, agonizing screams of the parasite who had drained their marrow. The ghostly, rhythmic wheezing echoing upward was not the breath of a leviathan. It was the collective respiration of dozens of men drowning in the euphoric climax of blood-soaked retribution. Amidst that suffocating darkness, one of the loggers standing at the bottom of the pit slowly tilted his head upward. His gaze locked dead onto Virgil's eyes staring down from the rim of the tower. There was no shock. There was no panic at being unmasked. Within those bloodshot eyes, utterly deranged by environmental paranoia, lay only a silent, frigid message. As cold as a glacial drift, the execution has commenced. Do you wish to partake, or do you wish to become the next corpse to fill this grave? A current of absolute zero ripped down Virgil's spine, instantly flash-freezing the final, lingering vestiges of humanity within him. He understood. Every logical construct of the law, every tenet of human morality held absolutely zero currency in the deep cut. This place was a pressure cooker that had violently detonated. Taggart's desperate pleas for salvation were abruptly extinguished, replaced instantly by a dull, wet, sickening sound. Thwack, the distinct sound of an axe blade biting into soft tissue. Then a second strike. A third, dense, deafening. The shadows at the bottom of the pit surged synchronously into the center. There were no more screams. There was only the sound of brutal, catastrophic butchery, the most primal, barbaric acoustic of the human species violently seizing the life of its own kind. A wave of asphyxia surged to the back of his throat. Virgil released his grip on the timber rim. His body plummeted in a free fall, crashing into the powdery snow beside Otto. "Where is Taggart? What did you see?" Otto seized Virgil's arm, his eyes wide with the feral, mindless terror, a torrent of tears freezing instantly against his cheeks. "We have to save him. We have to call the others. There is no Taggart." Virgil severed his words like a guillotine. His massive, scar-tissued hands clamped onto Otto's shoulders with such devastating force that the young man's clavicles groaned in protest. He dragged Otto's bloodless, chalk-white face close, exhaling a breath reeking of absolute despair directly into the boy's nostrils. "Listen to me, and listen well, Otto. There are no monsters. There are no demons, and there is no Taggart. Down there is only a hell excavated by the hands of men. And if you stand here for a single second longer, that pit will tear itself open and swallow you as well." Virgil violently yanked Otto's arm, whipping the boy around. Without a microsecond of hesitation, without a single backward glance, the veteran lumberjack plunged into the ashen, necrotic darkness of the pine forest. They ran. Ice and snow exploded beneath their frantic, desperate strides. The wind shrieked and howled in their ears, or was it the auditory hallucination of dozens of axes pulverizing a mound of ruined flesh at the bottom of a hole? Otto ran while choking on violent sobs, fully convinced he was fleeing from an ancient, supernatural entity. But Virgil Moss knew the truth, and the truth was incinerating his lungs. He was not fleeing from the devil. He was fleeing from his own complicity. By turning his back on Taggart's dying screams, by burying the existence of that mass grave in absolute silence, Virgil had officially signed a blood pact with the darkness. He had become an integral cog in the psychotic machinery of the Appalachian Ridge, a carrier harboring the virulent pathogen of isolation, lying in wait to seed it into the next forest across this freezing continent. The pathogen of isolation did not perish when Virgil Moss's fleeing footsteps left Taggart's mill behind. It merely burrowed deeper into his bloodstream, driving its roots into the darkest recesses of his frontal lobe, patiently awaiting the season to germinate. In the days following the disappearance of Foreman Cyrus Taggart, a silent, chilling exodus unfolded. The camp folded inward, consumed by the shadows of a winter that would never see a spring. When the authorities from the town of Casca trekked dozens of miles through the treacherous snow to investigate the masked disappearance, they found absolutely nothing. There was no corpse. There was no colossal wooden altar adorned with 12 rayed eyes. There was not a single forensic trace of the butchery that transpired at the bottom of the abyss. The deranged folklores recorded in later years would paint this vanishing with a sinister, occult brush, claiming the demons of the deep woods had reclaimed their unholy architecture, erasing all evidence to resume their vigil in the fog. Yet the physical reality carried the bitter, asphyxiating taste of ash and primitive cruelty. No dark magic eradicated a 12-foot wooden monolith. It was dismantled by the very same axes that had erected it. On that exact blood-soaked night, after Taggart's agonizing shrieks were permanently buried beneath the freezing dirt, the 70 loggers descended into a rabid frenzy of saws and axes, entirely deconstructing the edifice. They chopped those sinister pine logs into thousands of splintered fragments, hurling them into the blazing cast-iron stoves scattered across the camp. The perfect crime of the oppressed class did not culminate in remorse. They warmed their freezing bodies, using the very cremated remains of the guillotine they had built. All physical evidence vaporized through the chimneys, dissipating into the leaden skies of the Appalachian ridge, leaving behind only a mute forest harboring the most savage secret of mankind. Virgil Moss never felled another tree. Drifting southward, rebranding himself as a carpenter, he slinked through squalid, decaying towns reeking of stale beer and sawdust, mutating into a listless phantom of the industrial age. People love to recount the tale of Virgil as a tragic hero, an amateur monster hunter who dedicated the remainder of his life to prowling, documenting, and exposing the disappearances at logging camps across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. They tell tales of how he always unearthed those 12-rayed symbols oozing warm sap, how he immaculately recorded the exact tally marks upon the bark that corresponded to the number of men taken by the devil. But apply the penetrating gaze of a criminal psychologist to peer through that cheap detective facade. Would a man whose cognition had been severely warped by dissociative identity disorder, a man utterly complicit in the execution at the deep cut, suddenly undergo a miraculous moral awakening to become a savior of mankind? Never. Virgil Moss was not tracking the monster's footprints. He was the one sowing them. His aimless wandering from logging camp to logging camp was no investigative crusade. It was the textbook behavioral pattern of a serial killer compulsively returning to the scene to savor the euphoric aftershocks of his crimes, or worse, the dark pilgrimage of a deranged evangelist. Virgil actively sought out camps that shared the same suffocating prerequisites: draconian labor conditions, sadistic overseers, bone-shattering cold, and sensory-depriving isolation. He would sit in the lightless corners of grimy taverns, where the air was thick with sulfur and sweat, and whisper into the ears of men who were fracturing under the weight of cabin fever. He inoculated them with the venom of rebellion. He taught them the mathematics of excavating pits, the masterclass techniques of interlocking joinery required to fuse colossal tree trunks into a flawless mausoleum without a single iron nail. He branded their psyches with the 12-rayed circle, not as a supernatural ward, but as a blood-drenched signature, the corporate logo of a lethal cult, worshipping liberation through extreme violence. Under Virgil's masterful sculpting, cabin fever was no longer a spontaneous affliction. It was weaponized into a systemic contagion. 47 tally marks rapidly multiplied into 48, 50, 60. The victims were no longer solely the sadistic foreman. They were anyone who inadvertently stepped into the territory of men who had utterly forsaken the light of civilization. And then, having fulfilled his macabre calling as an architect of hell, Virgil Moss vanished on the night of December 14, 1901. A clinically clean, immaculate disappearance, as though he had willingly descended into the deepest pit of his own design to eternally rest alongside the very demons he had authored. More than half a century bled away, and the forest never ceased its hemorrhaging. The mutilated trees continued to weep their frigid, blackened sap. That was until the summer of 1968, when the air was suffocatingly thick with oppressive humidity and the moldering stench of rotting pine needles. A graduate student named Daniel Carr inadvertently pushed open the door to that crypt. Carr arrived in Michigan, armed with a camera, a notebook, and the hopelessly naive academic conviction that he was merely excavating the mundane history of the timber industry. He discovered the barren clearing. He laid eyes upon the wooden monolith, smothered in those grotesque 12-rayed symbols. Carr was not violently snatched by demons. When he scaled the lip of the tower to gaze into the abyss, the silence of the summer afternoon was not lacerated by some supernatural roar. It was only broken by the faintest, microscopic rustling. In the ink-black shadows of the pines, entities of flesh and bone stepped out. They possessed no horns, no feral claws. They were draped in ragged, decaying garments that had faded with time, their hands tightly gripping heavily rusted axes. They were the remnants, the inherited descendants of the isolationist cult that Virgil Moss had seeded. These were off-the-grid feral humans. completely cloaked from the civilized world, sustaining their existence by sacrificing any heretic foolish enough to pry into the forest's festering wounds. Daniel Carr stared into the most naked, unadulterated manifestation of evil, and he paid the ultimate toll by remaining forever buried beneath the unmarked loam, engulfed by the collective, wet, wheezing breath of a pack of beasts wearing the faces of men. The notebook of Virgil Moss, unearthed from the snow by a lumberjack in 1903, concluded with a single sentence, pressed so violently into the paper that it tore the yellowed parchment. "They are not gone. They are waiting." As I close these case files, I feel an invisible glacial draft slithering through every vertebra in my neck, but it is absolutely not born of the Appalachian pines or the urban legends of ghouls. The ghost story channels on the internet will feed your mind with imagery of ancient entities huddled beneath the snowpack, waiting to gnaw on your bones. How effortlessly comforting, how profoundly soothing it is to lay the blame at the feet of a supernatural evil. It grants us the luxury of washing our own hands clean. It allows us to sleep soundly, believing the monster is out there, rather than festering right here inside of us. But the truth is perpetually filthy, reeking heavily of primordial mud and the suffocating copper stench of fresh blood. There was no forest demon lurking in the deep cut. The true monster wore the visage of bottomless greed, violently draining the life force of its own species, exactly as Cyrus Taggart had done. That monster was birthed from absolute isolation, from an inescapable dark and the -20-degree frost, brutal physical catalysts that silently eroded the fragile membrane of civilization, amputating the human to leave behind only the most primal, feral beast. Those colossals, windowless towers were not a dimensional opening into hell. They were mass graves. They were silent guillotines, engineered by human intellect and constructed by the hands of men who had been pushed to the shattering boundaries of madness. They weaponized savagery to punish cruelty. The curse of the Appalachian Ridge never spread via dark magic. It propagated through a high-potent virus named the generational, inherent hatred of humanity. There is one fatal detail buried deep within the dead silence of those 1903 pages that I cannot stop obsessing over. 47 axe gashes on the bark, correlating to 47 nameless corpses. But if Virgil Moss, as the oral folklore dictates, was merely a lumberjack who stumbled blindly into the horrific truth, an accidental witness, then how did he possess such a surgical, intimate comprehension of the tower's interlocking joinery? How could an uninitiated outsider meticulously draft the exact interlocking blueprints, capturing tilted angle of that colossal tower in his notebook, unless he himself had personally assembled or dismantled it with his own two hands? Do you believe Virgil Moss was just a lucky survivor who fled that night of terror? Or, from the very beginning, hiding beneath his stoic, silent facade, was he the chief architect of these bottomless graves? Throw your most jagged, barbed theories into the comments below. Convince me. Rip this logical facade to shreds with your perspective. I will sit in the dark, pour myself a black coffee, and read every single one of them tonight. And tomorrow morning, when you step foot into your office amidst the rhythmic, monotonous clatter of keyboards, when you inhale the shared, suffocating air alongside complete strangers, take a second to look very closely at your boss. Observe your colleagues who are staring blankly into their monitors in absolute silence. Every form of repression has its breaking point, and any repression, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its own axe. This is The Dark. Hit like if the truth I just dissected makes you feel a freezing breath exhaling against the nape of your neck right now, and subscribe to join me in butchering the next brutal lie. Keep your doors deadbolted. Goodbye.